Hello, good morning and welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's. It's Monday, April the 13th, the start of a hugely consequential month at home and abroad. So it's great to be back in your ears early morning and back with you, Anne. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Plenty of politics for us all to come back to at home and abroad this morning. A new government for Hungary cleared the way for tougher European action against Russia. Victor Orban, who became a regular antagonist towards Brussels and the West over his 16 years in power, was defeated in a landslide. The consequences, huge, but will it help Ukraine?
The chief autocrat of Europe is out. Also, just as vital this morning, developments in the Middle East, where talks between the US and Iran broke down over the weekend, leading Donald Trump yesterday to announce that he was going to blockade any and all ships using the Straits of Hormuz.
Now, Britain was quick to indicate we would not be taking part in that blockade, with the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand both saying they haven't received a request for help, and Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary avoiding saying yes or no when asked about this. On the UK side, officials have been saying that naval vessels are already in the region, but that is for a scenario intended to come into play after a ceasefire. Britain wants to convene another round of Hormuz unblocking talks with over 40 non-US allies, but it's unclear if that major convening role is going to go ahead this week.
Yeah, it did seem that Donald Trump was rather confused about the British position yesterday. He went on Fox to say that the UK is sending minesweepers to help his blocking, but that's clearly not true. The UK is thinking about mine-hunting drones if a viable plan emerges, but that is, as Bloomberg was reporting, quite different to what the president was on Fox talking about. Surely we will get much clarity later when Keir Starmer stands up in the Commons at about 3:30 to give a statement there. It'll be a pretty pivotal moment because that comes, we think, about half an hour after the start of this new American blockade on all vessels entering or exiting Iranian ports. So we'll see what's happening in the region and to the oil price and the markets at that point. The whole cost of the Iran affair is laid bare this morning by an incredibly bleak report, an important report, actually, I think, by the Resolution Foundation. They say the typical UK household will be £480 worse off this year as a result of the war. Just a reminder, those who thought that they would be better off, well, before the Iranian conflict, the average typical household was on track to be 0.9% better off over the financial year. Now they're going to be 0.6% worse off over the current financial year, meaning that Keir Starmer, not because of anything of his own doing, is going to break a key pledge. So more on that in a bit.
Meanwhile, MPs returned to Westminster today for a consequential 2 or 3 weeks on the home front. We're coming up, it's just in 3 weeks' time now, to the local elections and national votes in Scotland and Wales. And a reminder, you can listen to our special episode looking at the possible fate of all the parties scrapping it out there in Scotland, Wales and England on May the 6th. That's 30 million people across Britain going to the polls. So a huge moment ahead. And right now in Downing Street, well, they're planning as to how to give Keir Starmer his best shot at survival over what will undoubtedly be one of the most rocky and testing periods of his premiership so far.
We're having to sort of analyse politics in split screen because there's stuff abroad and there's stuff at home and there's campaign stuff. Keir Starmer on a campaign visit to the Northwest, for instance, this morning. But I want to highlight a big thing, which is very much core to the audience of this podcast, Anne, which is over the next 2.5 weeks, there are going to be some massive moments of choice for MPs, particularly Labour MPs. That's because as well as coming up to the local elections, it's also coming up to the end of the parliamentary term. And any of the 17 bits of legislation that aren't completed before the end of term at the end of this month basically fall unless they are given a sort of permission to carry over in a vote. And there's huge stuff that isn't sorted. We'll talk about it at the end of this podcast, everything from Hillsborough Law to the Great British Railways Bill, to the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, and something I know that is close to your heart, which is about the Chagos Islands. But I'll say this, and we will monitor this every day. over the next 2.5 weeks, MPs are going to be at their most powerful because there is a hard deadline for when decisions have to be made. So they have leverage. So Commons in particular, with the potential for rebellions and dissent, will be able to force their way on Keir Starmer's government. Let's see whether it is a bumpy ride.
MPs, this is your chance to shine and to be really difficult. But let's start with Hungary because of the huge reverberations of that election for the EU and for the war in Ukraine, and thus also for British policy on that. So Viktor Orban went into this contest effectively with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in his corner, but the scale of the defeat by Peter Magyar, a supporter who turned apostate, has been stunning. It does look as if Magyar might even get a 2/3 majority, and that is a bit of a magic figure there in the Hungarian constitution because it was used by his predecessors to hold on to power in a constitutional lock that really made it very difficult to gainsay anything in any direction that Viktor Orban wanted. Now, will the West and will NATO find Magyar a return to the European path, as Ursula von der Leyen optimistically posted overnight, or something a bit more thorny? I think that is a question that will be going around the European capitals today.
Yeah, at the moment it seems to be sort of all celebration from the EU side, not least the gap between the concession by Viktor Orban and Ursula von der Leyen's tweet that you just mentioned. I think the EU will find the opening signals quite encouraging. He's promised that his first trips as Prime Minister will not be to Moscow or to Washington, but to two European capitals with which Hungary has had strong traditional ties, Warsaw and Vienna, as well as Brussels. And I think the point about his opening moves, Anne, is that he intends, as far as we know, to use this supermajority to deliver on campaign promises to deal with corruption and to clean up Hungarian politics. Why? Because Hungary had been denied access to billions of pounds of EU funding. It's put on the naughty step by the EU Commission, and there's at least 6.4 billion euros in grants and recovery and resilience funds, which, if the new Prime Minister is seen to clean up Hungarian politics, then the consequence of that is that they'll get that cash. That alone will bring Hungary much more into the mainstream orbit of the EU. But it's not quite as straightforward as that, is it?
No, it isn't. And this is where it's going to get complicated in a very Hungarian kind of way. And it also has consequences, as we were just touching on there, for what it means for Ukraine. And to what extent does Hungary come on side with the European and UK position when it comes to Ukraine, and particularly that 90 billion euro EU loan to Ukraine, which Europe is absolutely desperate to get across the line. It's just worth remembering, Sam, that Magyar's party Tizia voted against it. It's not just Orban against that. And he's leveraged a lot of anti-Ukraine feeling in Hungary in his campaign, saying that the outcome shouldn't be dictated by Ukraine, etc. He's not pro-Putin, and that's already a win. And that should also be put in the balancing scales here. Indeed, there's a Hungarian political joke which goes something like, we don't like Russians but we don't like Ukrainians any better than we like Russians. There are tensions there over it's a very positive political culture. There are tensions there over language rights in Western Ukraine and the ethnic Hungarian population there, and public sentiment is very opposed to being dragged into the war. But I think you did put your finger on something. This is a game of two halves. Hungary also needs access to EU funds. It needs to stabilize its economy, and a new leader is likely to want a big piece of that pie. Well, that gives the EU some leverage to try to do a quid pro quo and bring the country closer into at least fiscal support for Ukraine. But I don't think that would be particularly easy, as one official told Politico. It's a black box because we don't really know how far Magyar will take on public opinion. We do know he'll be pretty tough on Moscow. As you say, he's going to other European capitals, but That said, Poland and Vienna, Warsaw and Vienna, I should say, have not also been massively instigating on this big loan. And Vienna, in fact, has been blocking it. Just reminds us that Europe, and particularly East and Central Europe, is a pretty complex jigsaw.
It does also seem to signal something of a blow for the populist right globally. Of course, helping Victor Orban just a few days ago was the US Vice President, J.D. Vance. Nigel Farage has long expressed his admiration for Victor Orban, repeatedly calling him the future of Europe, celebrating his election victories and essentially going to sort of publicly going to see him at conferences. There was no overt backing on Nigel Farage's X feed that I could see this morning for Orban over the last 2 years, but the quotes are there in black and white. And I just wonder, particularly in the wake of Iran, which we'll talk about in a moment, whether or not there isn't a sense that that strand of politics isn't having the easiest time at the moment, because it'll be a big blow for definitely for Trump that somebody who he publicly backed so strongly just a few days ago didn't get re-elected.
Yes, and that J.D. Vance, who had a personally close relationship with Orban, turned up in the late stages of the campaign. He put his own skin in the game, and I wonder whether that will also have consequences when we look at the future of J.D. Vance. But let's not forget that Magyar is a strong nationalist. He comes from a populist nationalist tradition. He just happens to come from a part of it that fell out with Viktor Orban. He's very Hungary first, and he is a disruptor. He bulldozed his way through the post-1990 structures in Hungary and that autocratic might of Fidesz under Orban to get to the leadership. My colleague in the US, Alex Burns, has a really challenging piece, Sam, saying today that while this will give liberals some cause for celebration, and we heard that also in the streets of Hungary overnight and beyond, but he was pointing out that there's a bit of a dangerous lesson here for US Democrats, which is that it's outsider, difficult, thorny candidates who are sweeping races, not command and control ones that the party apparatus puts up, and that there could be warnings here for the big old parties of centre left and centre right. I mean, it might be more encouraging, if you like, to someone like Zach Polanski than it will be to the classic old centre left.
It's fascinating stuff. I think as consequential today is what's happening, though, in Iran. And we're in for a hell of a bumpy ride as everybody sees whether the near-dead ceasefire holds and what will happen with the markets. It seems like we got relatively close over the weekend, but in the end, it was a no-deal situation, and J.D. Vance and the Pakistanis and Iranians all walked away from the talks empty-handed. Where does this leave us, do you think?
Well, despite the talks breaking down, the Iranians are claiming some progress had been close and that the US and Iran were inches away from reaching a memorandum of understanding before the end of talks this weekend. The foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, wrote in an X post, which indicated that there might be an opening there to further talks. Well, he attributed the deterioration to US maximalism, shifting goalposts and blockade. But now the consequences are likely to be dramatic. That threat by Donald Trump to blockade the Strait of Hormuz predicted to worsen the global consequences of the conflict. And there's quite a lot of negative commentary about today, what the pain will be there in Asia, the knock-on effects across the globe in terms not only of the oil price, but the silting up of trade and trade routes. Again, is that useful to Iran? Because it perhaps means that for all the blowhard rhetoric, it will bring the Americans back to talks. But the fact is, they had a shot at it, and it's ended up with the administration threatening to block the straits that previously it was trying to open.
Yeah, I was very struck that the head of a big liquidity firm for oil, Onyx Capital Group, the managing director for them, called Donald Trump's move to blockade the straits demented. The economic consequences of this probably the most important for now, and on the domestic front, there's a big and important report, as we mentioned earlier, by the Resolution Foundation. There's an event with Ruth Curtis and the former Chancellor, Tory Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, this morning, which will pick through some of the sort of consequences in 6 to 12 months of what we're seeing right now, because we're in a weird situation where we're not feeling the pain particularly strongly yet that will emerge in the coming weeks and months. Yes, there are some fuel protests and problems in Ireland and some concern that might spread to the UK, but that's not where the biggest effects are going to be felt. It's going to be felt domestically in the mainstream of the economy. I've pulled out 3 statistics from the Resolution Foundation report that just suggest to me politics is going to get so much harder and so much trickier. Right. First of all, at the end of the year, they can see food inflation. The Resolution Foundation can see food inflation just shy of 10% if the blockages continue as they are, which is pain for every household, including those at the lowest end of the income distribution. Energy bills back up to around £2,000 this winter on the energy price cap. Currently, they're just over 1,600, so that's a big jump. And only some households will be protected by the Chancellor, it sounds like, judging by remarks before the holidays. And you've got 1.4 million people next year coming off their fixed rate mortgages. Now, for those who are on 5-year fixes, they'll have been on rates on average of 1.7%, and the market's now saying we're up at 5.1%. That is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds on people's mortgages. So food inflation, energy bills, and a big spike in mortgage costs. Unlike when this happened under Liz Truss, there was no domestic political blame. So there's just less domestic political conversation about this happening at the moment, but it's coming out and it's going to really hurt.
It is going to hurt. And it's a reminder that the consequences of what happens in Hormuz and in that standoff with Iran will overshadow the Starmer and Reeves economic outlook, I think, just as they were hoping after those elections in May to get back into the driving seat on that narrative. I take your point that there's not so much domestic blame to be apportioned, but governments in these situations do tend, thinking back to the oil crisis of the 70s, do tend to become punch bags for the public sort of squeal of anguish about how it is hitting them in the pocketbook. The Chancellor is heading this week to talks convened by the IMF on the crisis, and that is a reminder that this is being taken seriously across the world by governments who are looking at their budgets and not sure at all how they are going to make their previous plans work out at all. And if and when they don't, how do they explain that to their electorates and what they intend to do about it?
Right, let's skip the last minute or two onto domestic Westminster matters. And I think this is really important. As I was saying at the top, basically there's a 2.5-week deadline to get these 17 remaining bits of government legislation through. The government has 3 options. They either pass the legislation before the end of April, or they have what's known as carry-over vote, giving it permission to keep going in the next session, or it just dies. Now, for those bits of legislation where they can't foresee any problems, they will just push it through. So whether that's the tobacco and vapes bill, or a number of others, they'll just see if they can rush it through. But that speed gives MPs a lot of leverage. Then there are going to be some bills that are subject to carryover. This indicates there are problems with them. And I've got the list of which ones are likely to get carryover votes. It is things including the Courts and Tribunals Bill, which gets rid of juries, the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, which we know is causing a lot of angst all around the place. The Hillsborough Bill, there was a compromise suggested by the Times last night. I'm told the families at campaign groups very suspicious of that, but that's clearly not done. Railways Bill, the Votes at 16 Bill, and the Armed Forces Bill, and the one to do with cybersecurity. So all of those bills, they just can't get done, even though lots of important work there. And then some bills, are going to have to be left just simply to die, including the one about the Chagos Islands, which is a sort of massive moment.
I'm struck as you go through that list how many of those were really being fronted as flagship bills by Starmer, and now look like a lot of them will not be revived. Worth pausing very briefly to talk about that retreat from the Chagos bill, Sam, I mean, the official position remains the same despite Donald Trump's reversal of support and an attack on the plan as being stupid and worse, in his view. There is an argument. Ministers are saying they're still committed to the deal, and they are warning that anything else could mean Britain ending up losing practical sovereignty without a deal to protect the Diego Garcia military base, and that there might be some way in the future to get back to it. But to be honest, at the moment, it looks more theoretical than real. And it's just a reminder of how many of Starmer's previous plans and where he really put his weight and his heft, particularly his expertise and knowledge of international law, which I think he lent on very heavily to try to ring fence Chagos. It hasn't worked out.
Right. That is our 20 minutes up. Do stay in touch. It's going to be a busy old few weeks, and we want to hear from MPs that are planning to use their newfound power in the Commons and stick with us for all the twists and turns of the campaign as well, which we didn't have a lot of time for today. But we'll be back tomorrow for Politics at Sam and Anne's. See you then.
We can set up a hotline. See you tomorrow.